Some of you may have heard of a king by the name of Sennacherib. Ever heard of Sennacherib? He's very famous for a poem that was once written. I've forgotten the author now. Lord Byron, I think it was. The Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold. You know, probably you younger guys have never heard that poem because you didn't have to suffer that sort of thing when you were at school. But this poem tells about Sennacherib. Now, Sennacherib was an ancient Assyrian king, and the biblical writers mention him. They mention him in connection with a campaign he had against the Israelites. Now, the Assyrians were very cruel people. We could call them the terrorists of the ancient world, because these guys would skin a person alive. They would impale them on stakes. They talked about, you see images in the British Museum of them, looks like they're playing rugby, but they're human heads they're tossing around. In fact, we had a whole article in one of our latest Diggings magazines on the Assyrians and their cruelty. They were quite bizarre. Probably you can understand why, if you've ever heard of Jonah the prophet, he didn't want to go to Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrians, Now, the raid against the Israelites, the biblical writers mention a number of interesting facts or things that took place. When we look at what archaeologists have found, we notice that every one of those things pretty well has been found. For example, if you go to Israel today, you can walk through Hezekiah's tunnel. Now, Hezekiah was the king of Israel at the time that Sennacherib, the Assyrian, came to town. And Sennacherib, of course, was going to lay siege to the city of Jerusalem. And Hezekiah, you read in the biblical manuscripts, was trying to make sure his water supply was secure, because if you don't have a good water supply, if you don't have a good water supply in times of siege, you're done, aren't you? That's it, fight over, game over. So he was making sure he'd get his water into the city, and he built a tunnel. And you can walk through that tunnel today. Archaeologists have excavated it some years ago now, and you can walk through that tunnel. It comes from anywhere from here to even here, depending on what time of the year and how the spring of Gihon is bubbling. And you walk through that tunnel. It's quite a long way, about half a, what it was, about 3/4 of a kilometre, thereabouts. So a long tunnel. They began at both ends and they met in the middle. And as you come to the end, you see an inscription. Well, there used to be an inscription. We got it here now. No, not really. But this inscription was right at the end of the tunnel. And someone took it and stole it. And the first time I went to Israel, I was with Dr. Siegfried Horn, an archaeologist. And Dr. Horn was the man who rediscovered this. He was in the Istanbul Museum at the basement there somewhere, and he found this thing. And so today you can see the real one in the Istanbul Museum. And it tells us how that the men who dug the tunnel, they started at both ends and they met in the middle. So this is a very famous inscription that is in the Istanbul Museum today, but it's evidence that what the Bible says, that they dug a tunnel, the Bible says, we see tremendous evidence for that. Another thing that was interesting is Sennacherib, he besieged Jerusalem, but the Bible says that he would not get an arrow in there, he wouldn't even come in there and set a siege ramp against it. That's what the Bible says. And it says that one night 185,000 Assyrian soldiers were killed, just like that, by an angel of the Lord, it says. Now, for many people that sounds like a fairy tale, except when you go and look at some of the things that they've discovered, one of which is this. This cylinder here, prism, there are 3 of these on display in the museums. One is in Israel, the Israel Museum. Another one is in the Chicago Oriental Museum, the Institute of the Oriental, the Institute of the Orient, there in Chicago. They have a copy, and also we have one in the British Museum, also called the Taylor Prism. These tell us that the cities of Judah, that's part of Israel, that Sennacherib attacked. When he comes to Jerusalem, this is all that he says: I shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. He does not say he defeated him or anything like that, because he didn't. But he just says, I shut him up like a bird in a cage. So tremendous evidence for that campaign. By the way, the Egyptians tell us something interesting. They said, you know, the Assyrians went back to Assyria because an immense number of mice ate their bowstrings of their bows. And scholars have looked at that comment that the Egyptians make, I think it was around this time, and they said, you know, maybe there was quite a plague of mice, and that caused some bubonic plague, and it wiped out a lot of these Assyrians. We can't be sure, we don't know that part of it, but that's what some have conjectured. Now, there's something else. In the biblical account of this story, it says that when the Assyrians finally arrived in Jerusalem, Hezekiah said, oh, I'm sorry, I've offended you guys, I'm sorry. Here, I'll pay my taxes, because the reason the Assyrians came in the first place because he refused to pay tax. The Assyrians were the overlords, and they said, we've had enough of this. So the Assyrians came to get their taxes, you see. And so Hezekiah says, oh, please forgive me. And he said he paid tribute or taxes to the Assyrians. Now, when you go to the British Museum, you can see these huge human-headed winged bulls, massive things. On the flanks, they used to put some writing. And on one of those, it tells us, on the flank of one of these bulls, Hezekiah paid taxes to Sennacherib. Just like it's mentioned in the Bible. Again and again in that one story from the Bible, we have so much evidence that this is not a fairy tale. This is the real deal. So that's what we talked about last night in our first session, you recall. And I just wanted to make you aware of that, because you'll see some other inscriptions on display there this afternoon. And we'll point some of those out during the break. All right, let's begin and head off to Masada. By the way, anybody been to Masada at all? Somehow, there we go. All right. Now, I think we've got program 2 instead of program 1. So you can switch the programs for us, man. Thank you. All right. So how many been to Masada? Anybody been there? Okay, fantastic place. This place, Masada, we'll be journeying there this afternoon. All right, let's go. Now, I'm going to take you on a couple of places today. We're going to go back to Iraq during this one, and we're also going to go to the city of Jerusalem. In 322 BC, Alexander the Great was on his way to Egypt to do battle with the Medes and the Persians, because as you recall from last night's second lecture, that it was the Greeks who toppled the Medo-Persians. And the Medo-Persians had control of Egypt around this time. And so Alexander the Great was on his way down to Egypt. He was going to take out Jerusalem, and he went up to Jerusalem, but before he got there, some of the priests of the Jewish people came out to meet him. And they shared with him an incredible prophecy from the book of Daniel. And they showed him a prophecy written about 540 BC that you will find in the 8th chapter. As a result, Alexander the Great decided not to destroy Jerusalem. And what we want to understand this afternoon is how come, what's in that prophecy that changed Alexander the Great's mind? How come he never wiped out Jerusalem, because he just wiped out the people in Tyre? Why didn't he do the same to Jerusalem? How come that prophecy made a difference? We'll see that as we move in this afternoon. All right. 2,000 years ago in the city of Jerusalem, that's where we want to drop back to as we begin this afternoon. Herod the Great was the one who embellished the temple in Jerusalem at this time. Herod the Great was a magnificent builder, or built magnificent buildings. We wouldn't call Herod the Great magnificent man, that's for sure. He had built this great aqueduct that you can see that brought water to Caesarea. Caesarea, this is his palace there on your right. The palace in Caesarea was, you can visit today. Herod the Great also had about 4 fortresses that he'd built, one of which is Masada, another one here at the Herodian at Bethlehem. He also built Macarius, where John the Baptist was beheaded. That's over in what we would call Jordan today. Why did Herod have so many fortresses? Because Herod had a lot of enemies. For example, when Herod the Great died, he said, make sure you kill a lot of people so that someone will be crying when I die. What a bizarre sort of a character. this is the man who tried to kill the baby Jesus in the Christmas story, right? This is Herod the Great. We have a lot of information about this man who is mentioned in the biblical records. Now, Herod the Great, as we said, he embellished the temple in Jerusalem. In fact, he rebuilt it, but he rebuilt it while it was still operating. Little piece by piece, he pulled something down and built much like we do today in the airports when you visit them. They're doing some rebuilding while they're still functioning. So the temple took about 46 years at least to rebuild. And it wasn't finished even at the time Jesus the Christ came here. Herod began it. Now, it was to this temple that Jesus the Christ came so often. This was the building that he came to. Now, when he came here on one occasion, and by the way, the temple in Jerusalem was was really a symbol of Jewish nationalism. This was the pinnacle of Judaism in these times. And Jesus was taken on a little bit of a tiki tour, if we could put it that way, by his followers one day. And they were showing him this magnificent building, which the Romans had also helped to build, with financially that is. Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly," he said, "I say to you, not one stone will be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." So this whole structure is going to be demolished. Now you can appreciate the followers of Jesus, that took them back a bit. This magnificent building going to be torn apart? How can that be? So they came here to the Mount of Olives. Now we're taking this picture from the Mount of Olives, looking over the city of Jerusalem, and where that golden dome, it's called the Golden Dome Mosque, not really a mosque, but this is the third most important Islamic structure in the whole world. This building right here, the Golden Dome, where this building once stood in this area, the temple once stood in the time of Jesus the Christ, rebuilt by Herod. So they're looking over the city of Jerusalem right here, and they asked him this question. And I want you to notice the question they asked Jesus on this occasion as he met with them. They said, "Tell us, when will these things be? When is all this going to happen? That the temple will be completely demolished." At that point, Jesus began to give them a series of predictions covering 3 areas. So in this session, we're looking again at the proven track record of fulfilled predictions. We called this series Ancient Mysteries Reveal the Future. And last evening, okay, how do we know if this book is reliable? Well, number 1, it's historically accurate. Number 2, it's got a prophetic track record. We saw that last evening, and we're going to see it again right here as we look at what Jesus had to say. So he gave them a discussion now, or some predictions concerning, number 1, let's go back here, Jerusalem itself, the temple, and the Jewish people. So let's notice what he said. First of all, he said Jerusalem would be surrounded by an embankment or a rampart, and it would be destroyed. Notice his words. As he drew near, he saw the city and he wept over it. He'd made this prediction just a few days before. "The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you, and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground." So this is a prediction he'd made just a couple of days earlier as he's looking over this city from the Mount of Olives on that occasion as he came to the city of Jerusalem on a donkey. You may recall that. So from the same site. So there's the first prediction. Number 2, the temple to be totally destroyed. He's already mentioned that a few moments before when he was walking around the temple. But let me remind you what he also said a few days before. "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem," he's looking over the city, "you who kill the prophets and stone those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings." Like a mother hen, he says. "But you were not willing. See your house," that's a name for the temple. "Your temple is left to you desolate." It's going to be destroyed. And then, of course, those words he uttered that day, "Not one stone here will be left upon another." Now, you think about that. Here are some of the massive stones that make up the platform on which the temple was built. Now, I'm not suggesting the stones on top were necessary to this side, but there's some big stones that have formed part of this structure back in Herod's time. Some of these stones, 20 metres long, 2 metres wide, 3 metres high. That's a fair piece of rock, isn't it? Not one stone left upon another. Now these are today, they're just the retaining wall on which the temple once stood. I'll bring you back here in a little while. Then Jesus said these words, the Jews would fall by the sword. Third prediction he made. And notice what he said on this occasion. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword. All right. Now, you've probably heard the song down the Via Dolorosa, the way of tears and so on. Well, you come down the Via Dolorosa, the place where they say Jesus walked when he went to Calvary, and you will recall that when Jesus was going to the cross, walking down this road to the cross, that some women, if you've ever read the story, were crying for him. I mean, he was just beaten to a pulp just before this. And so they're weeping about his predicament. And he said these words to them. And a great multitude of the people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Why? For indeed the days are coming. He was making a prediction on the road to the cross. The days are coming, he said, in which they will say, Blessed are the barren wombs that never bore, and the breasts which never nursed. Why? Because he could see through his prophetic eye what was going to take place in the city of Jerusalem just down the track. And we're going to see even more of that. Number 4, Jesus said the Jews would be scattered among the nations. Quite a prediction. Notice what he said here. He said they will fall by the sword and they will be taken as prisoners to all of the nations. There's number 4. And the 5th prediction he made at this time was this one. The Gentiles, the non-Jewish people, they would inhabit the city of Jerusalem. Notice his prediction here, back again in Luke chapter 21. He said, Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles. That means non-Jewish people, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. A reference in the biblical writings to the end times. So, were these predictions fulfilled? 5 very specific predictions. Not sort of airy-fairy things, but very specific predictions. What happened? Were they fulfilled? How do we understand this? Well, let's go back to the history of what took place around about 66 AD. In 66 AD, Gessius Florus, who was the commander of Jerusalem for the Romans, he decided to take a temple tax from the Jewish people, and they said, nothing doing. We're not giving any more taxes to you Romans. And they massacred Gessius Florus's garrison there in Jerusalem. And they began what is known as the Great War of the Jews, beginning in 66 AD. So now the Jews were in control of Jerusalem for the first time for many years. Some of the zealots, they're called, who overthrew the Romans, they came here to Masada, because the Romans had taken control of this some years before, and they had a garrison up here. The Jews overran the Romans on top of this fortress of Herod the Great, and now they had it in their control at the beginning of the war with the Romans. And this is a magnificent place. You can see here Herod's palace. Herod had about 2 palaces at least on Masada. You can see one of them hangs off the cliff here. There are 3 levels to this palace. You can see up the top, in the middle, and down the bottom. A magnificent structure, and it overlooks the Dead Sea. You can see from here. There it goes, looking out across to the Dead Sea. See the circular part of the bottom here for his palace. He intended to live it up in great pleasure and ease up in this fortress in the wilderness. Now, when the Roman garrison was massacred, the Romans weren't going to, take that sitting down, so they sent Cestius Gallus to deal with this revolt. Cestius Gallus, in very quick time, had Jerusalem surrounded and on the ropes. Inside the city, many of the Jews were fighting each other as well for control of their own revolt. It was a tragic time for the Israelites at this time. But Cestius Gallus was just about to take over when he did something that nobody expected. We need to go back a little in our story when Jesus was talking to his followers. He warned them at the time he's looking over the city of Jerusalem and making these 5 predictions. He warned them, gave them some instructions, and I want you to notice one of them. This is what he said. He said, when you shall see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, he said, then know that its desolation or destruction is near. Then let those, or them which are in Judea, flee to the mountains. And let them which are in the midst of it, in the city of Jerusalem, let them depart out. And let not them that are in the country regions go into it. Now, here's a question. How do you escape a city when it's surrounded by the army? How are you going to do that? That's impossible. Yet Jesus told these men 40 years before, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, then run for your life. What a ridiculous thing to say, almost think. How are you going to do that? Well, interestingly, Cestius Gallus, for some reason, withdrew. We do not know, as historians don't understand why. But he withdrew his forces and left Jerusalem at this very point in time. Now, the Jews raced after him and had a big fight and defeated him. But in the interim, while they were fighting the Romans, the Christians in Jerusalem realized this is the time to run for your life. So they took off. Now, you would think, hey, this is not a good time to take off. I mean, our forces are just taken after the Romans but they said, no, this is the time. Jesus said, when you see the army surround, then take off. And so they did. And most of the Christians fled over here to Pella in Jordan. And this, of course, is of great interest to Sydney, because the Sydney University of Sydney has been excavating here at Pella for many years now and done some great work in excavating this place where the Christians fled to back in the times just after Jesus. Well, when Cestius Gallus was defeated by the Jews, especially as he retreated, the Jews savaged his withdrawing troops. When the Romans saw this, they said, okay, we're really going to come on you guys. And so they sent Vespasian. Now, Vespasian did something interesting. He attacked the towns of Judea, but he let the people escape, but only in one direction, Jerusalem. So attack a town, people ran off in Jerusalem. So everybody's eventually holed up in Jerusalem. That place is packed. And the Jews are inside the city. He can deal with them all at one time. As he's about to attack the city, Emperor Nero dies and Vespasian becomes the emperor of Rome, and he leaves to go back to Rome, and he puts his son Titus in charge of this campaign. Titus surrounds the city of Jerusalem. He besieged it in 70 AD. It's taken 4 years to get to this point, you see. The Jews were a thorn in the flesh to the Romans. That was the most difficult part of the Roman Empire to control, was Israel. They were fiercely independent or fiercely nationalistic and wanted their independence. He besieged the city of Jerusalem. What did he do? Well, number one, he starved the Jews. How did he starve the Jews? We know how he starved the Jews now. He built a 5-mile earthen rampart or wall around Jerusalem to keep people from getting out or getting in with relief. What did Jesus say? 40 years before, they will build a wall around this city. And exactly what they did. Not only that, but Josephus tells us, if you read his account of this siege, 1 million Jews, he says, perished in this siege of Jerusalem. It was a slaughter. You read his account of how the Romans just marched over corpses and piles of bodies to get to the rest of the people who were still fighting. The Jews would not give in on this occasion, and tragically many, many people lost their lives, and it has been down through the centuries, as you well know. Last year I was in Auschwitz and saw firsthand the terrible place where a lot of Jewish people were killed during the Second World War by the Nazis. You can visit this place, and of course Jews visit it all the time because this is a very important place to them where many of their own people were killed, and very many different persecutions the Jewish people have suffered down through the centuries, country after country. It's tragic, but the prediction of Jesus was quite correct. This is what would happen, and tragically it has happened. Now, the Jews' last stand was right here in the temple. This model of the city of Jerusalem you can see if you visit the Hebrew University today, but you will notice up the top right-hand corner, there's a big fortress. This is known as the Fortress of Antonia, because the Romans knew that if there was going to be a Jewish revolt, it would be centered in the temple, because this is the symbol of their nationalistic pride. And so they built this fortress to keep an eye on things. The Romans actually ruled from Caesarea, but they sent soldiers up at important festivals that the Jewish people had during the year, and this was the place where they stayed. The Jewish soldiers had, when they defeated or massacred the Romans, eventually the Romans took that back again, and now the last fight was right here in the very temple itself. Now, Titus had warned his soldiers, do not destroy the temple. I mean, number one, the Romans had poured a lot of money into that themselves. Don't destroy this building. It's one of the most magnificent buildings in the ancient world at this time. Don't destroy it. But in the fighting that took place, the fierce fighting, someone threw a firebrand into the temple and the whole thing went up in smoke. And after the fires had gone out, because of the gold and the silver in that temple, much of it melted down between the cracks of their massive rocks that formed this temple, and when the fire was over, the Romans just tore those stones apart to get the gold and the silver. And not one stone was left upon another. If you go to Jerusalem today, you can visit the basement of the retaining wall, and that's the wall from Herod's time on your far right, but here are the rocks and the stones that have been tossed down by the Romans when they demolished this temple. Here are some of the rubble from that great fight that took place here. And if you visit Jerusalem today, this is the area of the temple. It's as flat as a pancake. The only structures there are the Islamic structures that were put up much later, 700 or 800 years after this time. These are the structures, but not one stone left upon another of this massive temple. Now, if you visit Rome today, make sure you go to the Roman Forum, because you can look up under Titus's arch. He had a victory arch built, and when you look up underneath, there you'll see the Romans carrying away from the temple the 7-branch candlestick in Jerusalem. I tell you, my friends, when Jesus made predictions, and when this book makes predictions, they are always spot on. This is not a batting average of 15%. This is a batting average of 100%, this book. Uncanny in its accuracy, specific details. Well, you remember that today there is no Jewish temple. Jews come to the Western Wall to pray and mourn over the fact that the temple is no more, because that's the reality. There is no temple today. Now, after the temple had been destroyed and the revolt had been put down in Jerusalem, the Romans turned their attention to Masada, because now there were 900 Jewish zealots on top of this mountain. They had turned this fortress into building places for their wives and their kids, and so there were 900 of them up here by 73 AD. Now the Romans came up here under Flavius Silva. Some 10,000 soldiers came here to get these 900 off the top of this mountain. A very difficult task indeed. You will notice the snake path, it's called. Most people don't walk up that. They catch the chairlift that goes up to the top today. But that was the only way up this mountain at the time the Romans came here. Very easy to defend, as you can appreciate. So the Romans decided to do a bit of building themselves. First of all, they built these Roman camps. You can still see from the top of Masada the outline of them, where they made walls around their own camps so they wouldn't be massacred by the Jews who would come down in the night time and so on. So they had these camps dotted around the base of Masada. And then they built this siege ramp with lots of slave labour that came up to the lowest point of this mountain. So a massive wall, a ramp, so they could bring their machines up to batter at the walls at the top. Quite a feat of engineering. And you can still see today some of their missiles that they threw into this fortress with their catapult machines. They just were really determined to take this place. Well, they finally broke through in this place here one night, just before dark. They broke through the wall. The Jews, by the way, these are what we call double casemate walls, double walls. And the Jews had turned these things into rooms for a while, but when they saw where the Romans were trying to pound in, they filled it with dirt and timber so that it would compact. But the Romans set a light to the thing and were able to get the thing blazing, and with their rams they finished it off. So this is where they break through. And the Jewish defenders knew that tomorrow morning, when the sun comes up, they are going to pour in here and they're going to kill us, they're going to rape our women and slaughter everybody or take us as slaves. So that night, while the Romans were sleeping, the Jews had a meeting right here in the synagogue that had been built. And in this synagogue, the leader of the Jewish forces, Eliezer ben Yair, gave a stirring speech in which he told them what would happen the next day if they did not do what he was about to suggest. And the suggestion was this: let's commit suicide. Let's take our own lives and that of our wives and children, and when the Romans come up here, they will have all been in vain. Nobody will be here. We'll all be dead. So that's what they did. Every man killed his wife and his children, and then 10 men were chosen to go as those men, other men, lay down beside their wives and children who were now dead, and they ran them through with a sword, and then those men fell on their own swords, and it was it. 3 people survived. An old lady and a couple of kids hid away, and they're the only ones that the Romans saw when the next morning they came up here. By the way, archaeologists even discovered the 10 lots that were chosen to select the men. Amazing excavation here by Ugay Yadin some years ago now. And all they found as the wind swept across the top of Masada were these dead bodies. And they were overtaken to think of what had actually happened the night before, and the tenacity of those Jewish defenders. Well, that was the end of the 66 AD uprising, but the Jews were at it again. In 135 AD, we have what is known as the Bar Kokhba revolt, and this was during the time of the Emperor Hadrian, and Hadrian said, I've had enough of this. We've had it up to here. And so they drove the Jews, most of them, out of Palestine, scattered them all over the Roman world. And that was the end of things for nearly 2,000 years. And the Jews have been scattered around the world ever since. In fact, there are more Jews living outside of Israel than there are in Israel by far today. The great cities of New York, I was there a couple of years ago running this series of programs, some 2 million Jews living in Brooklyn alone, or in New York alone. Moscow, London, they are scattered around the world. It's uncanny how Jesus knew that that was going to happen 2,000 years ago, but that's the reality today that we see. Finally, Jesus predicted that the Jews, the non-Jews, the Gentiles I should say, they would inhabit the city of Jerusalem. And that's the case today. Some of you have been to Jerusalem. You know, the old city of Jerusalem is divided into a section for the Jews, there's a section for the Arabs, the Armenians, and there's a section for the Christians. And 3/4 of those are not Jewish people. It's trodden down by the Gentiles today. In fact, the most sacred place for the Jewish people in Israel is the Temple Mount, and it's controlled by the Palestinian Arabs today. Now, the Jews let them do it because they know what will happen if, you know, we saw what happens. When Ariel Sharon came up here onto the Temple Mount, we had another intifada. 1,000 Israelites lost their lives and 3,000 Palestinians just the last few years ago. This is controlled by the Arabs today, not the Jewish people up on top. I tell you, my friends, it is unbelievable, the accuracy of the prophecies of this book. No question. Christ's predictions were exactly fulfilled. Now, we're going to go in our next session after we take a break now. We are going to have a look at, we'll continue on now. My apologies, I was thinking it was the next session. We'll come to that in a moment. I want to show you something. Where did Jesus get all this stuff from? Where was Jesus getting much of this? Not all of it, because he made his own predictions, but where did he get it from? He got it from Daniel chapter 8 and 9. Because let me read you something. When you go to the prophet Daniel, and we mentioned Daniel last night, we saw a whole prophecy. Daniel says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, destruction, spoken of by Daniel, this is Jesus speaking, I should say, about Daniel, says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, in the temple, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That's the context. Where did he get this from? Some of it from the book of Daniel. And I want to take you there now before we wrap this up this afternoon. The book of Daniel, as we saw last evening, was a favourite of the Essenes, or we believe it was the Essenes who copied those Dead Sea Scrolls, some of which we have out on display again this afternoon, some different ones. You'll see the book of Genesis, part of that. You'll also see some other parts of the biblical records there from the Dead Sea Scrolls collection. Now, Daniel was one of the most favourite sections of the Bible for these people. And we remember the book of Daniel, alongside the other parts of the Dead Sea Scroll, they date back to 100 to 200 BC, before the time of Christ. So this is not looking at something that was happened after and you're writing it to make it look like a prophecy. Lots of genres can do that. Some things, they look like a prophecy, but actually we know they were written after the event to make it look like, no, this happened before. The Dead Sea Scrolls are written 100 to 200 years before Jesus, before the time we're talking about. Now, Daniel in the 8th chapter sees a great war. You might like to read this sometime. He sees a great war between a ram and a goat. I want you to notice what he tells us. Now, he's writing originally about 530 BC. Who do the ram and the goat represent? Number one, the ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. Now, Daniel is writing this during the time of Belshazzar. We talked about Belshazzar last night, who scholars said never existed, and then they found tablets mentioning this man and as a co-regent. He's writing during this time, but he predicts the Medo-Persians are coming next. They're coming next, and he mentions them by name right there. Well, what about the Greeks? So the ram is Medo-Persia. What about the Greeks here? Or the goat? It's Greece, he says. The male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. 200 years before the Greeks came to power, Daniel predicts their arrival to topple the Medo-Persians. You try that sometime. You try making a prediction, 200 years, this is what's going to happen. I tell you, you'll be wrong pretty well. Maybe you might jag it. But the Bible always gets it right, and certainly got it right here. By the way, so not only is the goat Greece, but he says the horn between its eyes is the first king. Who's the first king of the United Greek Empire? Alexander the Great. Everybody knows that from their history. Alexander the Great. Now, the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between his eyes is the first king, says Daniel, or Daniel is told. Now you can understand why Alexander the Great, when he was shown the 8th chapter of the book of Daniel, he said, whoa, that's me, man. I'm the Greek leader. That's me. You guys have got it right. That's why he didn't destroy their city. You wouldn't either if someone had told you you're going to be number one and you're going to topple the enemy. You'd sort of think they're pretty good people. So that he marched on to Egypt because of this prophecy that you're hearing today that Daniel wrote so long ago. Then he goes on and he says this, therefore the male goat, he grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of the heaven, 4 points of the compass. As for the broken horn, that's the first king, and the 4 that stood up in his place, 4 kingdoms will arise up out of that nation, but not with its power. So what is Daniel being told now? Daniel, 200 years before the Greeks come to power, that first horn, that's the first king. But when that king is broken, in other words, when he dies, when he loses his power, 4 are going to come up in his place from that same nation. In other words, Greece is going to be divided in 4. Did that happen? Well, if you know your history, exactly that's what happened. Alexander the Great died here in Babylon. And when he died, his plans for a great empire that stretched right across Mesopotamia, out to Greece and down to India, it died with him. And 4 of his generals fought for control of his empire. I mean, you probably saw the exhibit on Alexander the Great down here at Sydney a couple of years ago. I went to see that exhibit. It tells the story right there and during that time. These 4 generals fought for control of Alexander's empire. But all they succeeded in doing was divided it into 4 regions. And Greece was divided. The 4 notable ones, for 4 horns, came up toward the 4 winds of heaven, and out of one of the 4 winds, one of the points of the compass, one of those 4 points came a little horn, he sees now, which grew exceeding great. Greece was great, but this was exceeding great. Toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land, or the promised land as it's called. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary, the temple, was cast down. He also shall stand up against the prince of princes. Now let's just pause for a moment. What's happening here? Let's take a journey. First of all, there's going to be a ram, which he's told is Medo-Persia with 2 horns. Why the 2 horns? Because it was a dual empire, Media and Persia. We know that from history. But Daniel predicted that. Then he says that will be taken over by this goat with a notable horn between its eyes, who when he dies, that nation, the Greeks, will be split into 4. And that happened. And then from out of one of the 4 points of the compass will come a horn which is exceeding great, and it will do all that stuff. Let's put it up here now. Let's put it up. This little horn. What's this little horn that's going to take over from the Greeks? How do we understand? What does this little horn represent? Well, it's Rome. And I'm going to show you why it's Rome from the prophecy that was made 530 BC. And at least 100 to 200 BC. Let's notice the actions of the little horn. Let's put them up. Number 1, it says he went south. Now, Daniel is the prophet. He's writing. He's a Jew. He's talking about what comes from the south. Always south is Egypt. You look at it on your geography. That's the great nation of the ancient world down south, Egypt. So this horn is going to go down to Egypt. Number 2, it went east. That's Mesopotamia. That's the other great area, the cradle of civilization. It's going to take over there. Number 3, he's going to go to the glorious land, which is a name in the biblical prophets for Israel. He's going to march into Israel itself. Number 4, this power, by the way, the Romans did that during the time of Pompey. At 63 BC, the Romans came to Israel for the first time. This is before the Dead Sea Scrolls, 100 to 200 BC. All right. Number 4, it's going to be greater than Greece. It's going to be exceeding great. And we know that from the history. On one occasion, one of the Greek kings of those 4 divisions, he decided he'd go to Egypt and take over Egypt. And a Roman ambassador happened to meet him on the way, just an ambassador. He said, listen here, man, and drew a circle around him. Step out of that circle and you're dead meat. Meaning, we're telling you Greeks what to do. And so the man went off with his tail between his legs because the Romans had spoken. They were much greater and they finally toppled the Greeks even down in Egypt. You've heard of Mark Antony, Cleopatra and all of that sort of thing. Number 5, it would stand against Jesus Christ, who in the biblical writings is called what? The Prince of Princes, the King of Kings. Now, of course, that's no surprise to us where that took place at the cross of Calvary, because it was the Romans who were used by the Jews to do this terrible deed back 2,000 years ago. But it said they would cast down the sanctuary of the temple. We just saw that's exactly what the Romans did. They demolished the temple back in 70 AD. Yet Daniel had predicted that 500 years before, nearly 600 years by this time. Uncanny, the accuracy of the biblical prophets. Finally, it said they would take away the temple daily sacrifices, which of course is obvious. If you have no temple, there are no sacrifices. It's done, it's finished, and that's what happened back then, 70 AD. Finally, it said this power would trample on God's people. If you've studied a little bit of Roman history, you'll know what took place from the time of Nero onwards. If you've ever done a little bit of that, I've travelled here to Rome a number of times and always come to the Colosseum, because in that place and down in the Circus Maximus there in Rome, hundreds, probably thousands of Christians were fed to the lions and had tar poured over them to be set alight for the games for the Romans, right here in these great arenas. No question the Romans persecuted the people of God. Now, I want you to think. We said if you want to have a source that knows the future, you need a source that is historically accurate. My friend, this book has it. It's it. Number two, it's got a prophetic track record of fulfilled predictions. It does not guess at it. We saw that last evening with one of the greatest prophecies, where we tracked from Daniel's time right on down to our very own. Now we've seen this series of predictions from Daniel. Jesus adds to it because he's got a prophetic eye here. We've seen this again. But in the next session, we're going to have a break in a moment, we are going to come down to our day from what Jesus talked about as he continued. He took us to the Romans, to the destruction of Jerusalem. All happened. Now he's going to take us from there to our day. If that was right, you're going to see when we come back as we go to Pompeii, he sure got the rest right, because you and I are living right among it today.